So, without any further ado, to begin, on behalf of the Hastings and Rye Palestine Solidarity Campaign, we're thrilled to welcome our two eminent speakers this evening. Ghada Karmi is a prominent author, activist and academic. She is a 1948 Palestinian, which means her family were expelled from their home in Jerusalem in April 1948 during the Nakba, or catastrophe, when 720,000 Palestinians were expelled by Israeli forces. They came to live in Golders Green in North London, where Ghada grew up. She trained as a Doctor of Medicine in Bristol University, and she worked in clinical practice for many years. Ghada was a founder of Palestine Action in 1972, which was then the only political group lobbying for Palestinian interests in the UK. She has since worked tirelessly to promote Palestinian history, interests and fight for justice, even returning to her homeland in 2005 to work for the Palestinian Authority. Among her many books, Ghada has written 2 memoirs, In Search of Fatima, which describes her family's flight from Palestine and Ghada's upbringing in the UK, and Return, a Palestinian memoir, which takes us back to Palestine with her in 2005. Formerly, she was a research fellow at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. Currently at the University of Exeter is Ilan Pappé. Originally from Haifa in Israel, Ilan is Professor of History at the College of Social Sciences and International Studies. He's the Director of the university's European Centre for Palestine Studies and Director of the Exeter Centre for Ethno-Political Studies. He has written extensively on Israel and Palestine and is one of a handful of historians challenging the narrative myths of Israel's creation, arguing in his seminal work, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, that far from the indigenous population leaving of their own accord, they were systematically expelled, an act that would today be known as ethnic cleansing. Welcome, Ghada and Ilan.
Hello.
Turning to you first, Ghada, you were just 9 years old at the time, but can you tell us what you experienced in the months leading up to the day when you had to flee your home and what expulsion meant for you and your family?
Well, insofar as one's memory serves, this was a very difficult time because as a child, I didn't really understand what was happening. But what I did understand was that life had changed for the worse, that it was frightening. There was a lot of fear in the air. My parents were scared, and that was very scary in itself. And, you know, there would be shootings. Snipers had taken charge of some of the empty buildings around us and many people in our street had already left because of the bombings and the turbulence. And so snipers who were Jewish, we understood, took over and would take pot shots at people walking on the street. That was very frightening. But you know what is the worst of all was that we actually left, because you know. And especially as a child, okay, things are difficult and so on, but it would never amount to you leaving your home, all the things you'd known. You would somehow imagine that it would go on and might get better and so on, but not that you would leave. And that is really the really worst moment of all. The morning we left, now, anybody who's read In Search of Fatima will see an account of that early on in the book, because it was so serious for me. It was so unforgettable. We left the house behind, everything behind that we had, because we would think we would be away for long. My parents thought it was just a question of evacuating us children while things settled down, in quote. And we had a dog. He was a mongrel, but we loved him. And of course, he had to be left behind. That was, for me as a child, that was extremely important. I realized through that something terrible was happening, because the dog had to be left behind. So, you know, those are some of the memories of that awful time. And of course, the journey into Syria. To Syria, yes, to Damascus, through a country already with a war going on between Jewish soldiers and the opposition, Palestinian opposition. Very scary. Anyway, there we are. That's what happened just in the immediate period in 1948.
And Ilan, Palestinian families like Ghada's fled, but this wasn't an unfortunate byproduct of the creation of Israel. The expulsion of the indigenous population was well planned, it was systematic, and it was a deliberate campaign. Can you describe the origins of this plan and what it meant on the ground?
Yes. First of all, thank you for having me in Rada on this. And we are happy to be guests in the Hastings and Rye Solidarity movement. And we're happy to hear that you are growing in numbers. And I hear similar things from other solidarity groups around Britain. And in this time when the world is busy with other issues, it's so good to know that Palestine is not forgotten and people of all ages and all walks of life still feel committed. That's very, very important. To your question, and indeed Rada's book and what Rada mentioned is one story out of many that attest to the crime committed against the Palestinians in 1948. And ethnic cleansing is a crime against humanity. It's not just a policy going wrong or an unintentional collateral damage of a war. It's an ideological plan to expel massively people only because of their ethnic identity or national identity. If we talk about the origins of this, there are two ways of looking at it, and I will do it in a very short version, of course. One is to understand the nature of the Zionist movement, a settler colonial movement. And settler colonial movements all around the world were motivated by the wish and the impulse to remove the native indigenous people and replace them with the settlers. The late Edward Said used to call it a project of displacement and replacement. And this is at the heart of the Zionist movement's attitude and perceptions and vision for the native indigenous people of Palestine. So from the very beginning, the Zionist movement saw the removal of the Palestinians from Palestine and taking over as much of Palestine as possible as two very important goals, or I would say even conditions in their eyes for the success of the Zionist movement. But until the 1930s, they could not contemplate it in any serious way because there were too few of them and they were busy with other issues. But as we reach the end of the Second World War, in particular when it becomes clear around 1946, 1947, that Britain is going to leave Palestine, the ideas that might have been abstract or theoretical at that stage about removing the indigenous people of Palestine are translated into a proper strategic plan of massive expulsion. And I would say that from the moment the British government announced its decision to leave Palestine, which was on the 1st of February 1947, and until February 1948, a year passed, until the first village, a whole village, was expelled by Zionist forces. In that particular year, the ideas become a systematic and a well-planned program for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. So the origins, if you want, are first of all ideological. It's part of the Zionist ideology. They are strategic in the sense that a group of Zionist leaders set for a year and prepared the massive expulsion of the Palestinians. And then it became a policy from February 1948. One should mention that in February 1948, two international actors were committed, according to their own statements, to defend the Palestinians. One was Britain, which was still responsible for law and order in mandatory Palestine and did nothing to stop the ethnic cleansing that for 3 months was carried out under their nose, with them watching and doing nothing. And the United Nations that promised the Palestinians, regardless of whether they accept partition plan or not, that the international body would safeguard their life, their property, and their dignity. That was the definition, and of course did nothing about it. And this is why the Arab world, some of the regimes reluctantly, but under the pressure of public opinion, tried to do something, which was a bit too late and too little, but probably without its intervention, the ethnic cleansing would have been much worse than it was, and it was bad enough. As you know, half of Palestine's villages were demolished, most of the towns were de-Arabized, and half of the people of Palestine, of the Palestinians, became refugees. So I think that's in a nutshell, but of course one should read more about this, not only in my book, excellent other books as well. This is all very well documented. It's only, unfortunately, still denied by so many people in the West, either out of ignorance or maliciously in order to support the state of Israel and ignore on purpose a crime that was committed then and is still committed today.
Thank you, Ilan. And yes, it's very well laid out in your books, the Plan Dalet, the actual plan itself to expel the Palestinians, and it was extensively written about in their own archives, which you use for your book. So it's a matter of record that took place. So returning to you, Ghada, you first went to Damascus and you stayed with your parents, your mother's parents, and eventually your family came to live in Golders Green in North London. Can you tell us what stopped you from returning and what it was like to move to England? How did your identities now as exiles affect you all?
Well, as you say, of all ironies, that we fled Jerusalem to end up in Golders Green, you know. And I must tell you, in those days, the sort of Jews who were present in Golders Green were very similar to the kind of Jews that we fled from, meaning that they were German or at least East European. So in a way, we hadn't moved at all. Anyway, look, it was very hard. What can I say? I mean, got to understand, you know, here was a very ordinary family. We're an ordinary family who never, ever expected to travel that far in any case, let alone in those circumstances. So we turn up. I spoke no English whatever, and nor did my mother, nor did my brother. The only people who spoke English were my father and my older sister. So we had all those things to wrestle with, language we didn't know, a whole environment which is utterly alien. And I remember among my earliest memories, it just shows you, I remember looking around me at the airport and seeing lots of people scurrying about and thinking, funny, none of the women are pregnant. Because it shows you that in an Arab context, young women would often be expecting a baby. You know? And it was a thing that really struck me. Anyhow, look, it was very difficult. We ended up in Golders Green and had to do what we could, you know. I had to make the best of it.
Your mother never thought she would stay, did she, in the UK? And that affected how she lived in her home, is that right?
Yeah. Now, because that brings us to the question of return. First of all, it should be clear that my parents never ever thought for a moment that they wouldn't be going back with us. You know, they would say things like the world would never allow it, the United Nations would never allow it, it can't happen, that kind of thing. So they carried on for a bit like this. Now, my mother, in preparation for this supposed return, kept us in what I can only call a state of temporary existence. Honestly, you don't know what that means. In those days, we had no central heating. We had, now central heating was around, but there was none in our house, which was fairly old and decrepit. And so, you know, we'd say to her, look, can't we have some central heating? Because we visited friends who did. And she'd say, no, 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 we're not staying. So every time you asked her for anything which meant a home improvement or even buying a fridge at the beginning, she'd say, no, 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 we're not staying. I can remember our food being left outside in the cold because she wouldn't have a fridge. And that's how it was. Now, she kept our home in a state which was, I can only call, a frozen tableau of Palestine, 1948. You know, so everything inside was Arab and Arabic, music, radio, conversation, food, habits, all of it. Now, I can only ask people to imagine who haven't read the book, but I dare say a lot of people can imagine now because there's so many migrants. But at the time, you know, it was utterly bewildering for me. There I was inside my house, in other words, in Palestine, and I'd open the door, front door, go out into England. Totally different language, manners, behavior, people, looks, the way people look. And this happened every day. Every day when I went to school, came back, this is the same story. Now, to say it was bewildering is an understatement. I mean, I spent years of my early life in a state of confusion about who I really was. I didn't know whether I belonged to those people that's represented by my mother and their Arab friends and so on, or those people, that's the people in Golders Green, many of whom, as I say, are Jewish. So here you have another layer of confusion. So so in answer to your question about return, in the early days, in the early years, I'd say, my parents and their friends believed we would all go home and that it could not be allowed to last. People like me were lost and eventually, of course, decided, you know, we're here, we've got friends and you know, we're staying, that sort of thing. But it's remained, it's stamped on me, I can tell you, throughout my life. This whole theme of return is something that I think underlies my feelings, my character, of course, as I grew older, it was no longer a belief that we would somehow pack our bags and just take a plane and go. No, but the arrant injustice of this, the terrible thing that was done, enraged me and enrages me still. The idea that this state or any other group of people should get away with a crime like this, I can't accept that. And I tell you, I'm on record as saying I won't die until we can all go home. I refuse to die.
I hear you, Ghada, and thank you. Ilan, so these Palestinians, the refugees, were instantly made homeless. They were never allowed to return home again. Can you describe to us what the mechanisms were that prevented them from going home and how the international community was involved or complicit in that?
Yes. Well, already in June, July, that is even before the ethnic cleansing operations in 1948 ended, and there were still some hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who would become later in the end of the summer and in the autumn and winter refugees later on. Even before that happened, the Israeli government decided to wipe out the existing villages, physically wipe them out, believing that if you destroy the village entirely, totally, this would prevent people from returning. So the destruction, the physical destruction of homes, both in the city and in the countryside, was the first step to try and prevent return. Then, when the fighting, so to speak, subsided in the end of 1948 and through the beginning of 1949, when some of the refugees were trying to come back, believing that the fighting was over, and as always happened, they could return back to their villages, which unfortunately in many cases already did not exist. Israel used a policy of shooting at refugees, making sure that they would not cross the borders. And those who succeeded in smuggling themselves into their homelands were quite often arrested. Um, I know it's very difficult to see it today as possible, but had it not been for American pressure on Israel for a few months, only for a few months, at least one group of refugees, 25,000 out of 1 million, so it's not a big one, but 25,000 refugees were allowed to stay after coming back after the first wave of expulsion. But more important, I think, than anything else, and this connects to the second half of your question, is the kind of tacit understanding that existed between Israel and the international community about the fate of the refugees, which I think is very important to realize today when UNRWA comes under attack from the American administration, and when people regard the Palestinian demand for the right of return as unrealistic, or something people would say, come on, bygones are bygones, let's move forward. It's important to go back to that period and understand the kind of alliance that existed between Israel and the international community about this. And the idea was the following, that the Israeli narrative of why the Palestinians became refugees, first of all, would be accepted, namely that Israel has no responsibility for them becoming a refugee. For years, in universities in the West, in the press, in the speeches of politicians, you could hear people parroting the Israeli explanation that somehow the Palestinians left by their own accord, voluntarily, or because the Arab world called upon them to leave, and therefore there is no moral responsibility or a political responsibility for Israel to get them back. In fact, Israel should now be justified by not allowing them to come back, given the fact that they supported, so to speak, the attempt by the Arab world to destroy the state of Israel. This was the Israeli narrative, and it was accepted by people, and some of these people in positions of power in the West knew very well that this was a lie, but decided that they don't want to put any pressure on Israel and sacrifice the Palestinian for what they thought was an alliance with a strategic ally in the Cold War, or maybe people had some guilt complex about the Holocaust, and that also played a role in this, we should remember. And therefore, this alliance, which the first thing, as I said, was accepting that Israel shouldn't be accountable to what happened, was connected to another idea that the Israelis sold to the West. And in brackets, we should remember when we talk about the international community in 1949, 1950, it doesn't include most of the colonized world. So when you talk about the United Nations or international justice tribunals, you have to remember the only people represented there are the Western powers. And they accepted the Israeli demand that the Palestinian refugees would not benefit from all the basic rights that refugees all over the world already enjoyed according to international conventions. Namely, if refugees wanted to return, the international community had to do everything possible to allow them to return. Of course, there were cases when refugees were afraid to return. But the whole idea that a special set of rules was fixed for the Palestinian refugees was a collusion between the state of Israel and international organizations who knew exactly that they are violating the basic rights of the refugees. And I would finish by saying that on top of it, the rhetoric of the United Nations, as can be seen from Resolution 194, that was adopted on the 11th of December 1948, was that, of course, the United Nations General Assembly could not deny the right of the Palestinian refugees to return. Neither could the United Nations mediator, Count Bernadotte, which the Israelis assassinated, could deny the right. This is a basic right, nothing to do with a political solution. People who were expelled had the right to go back to their homes. So the United Nations adopted a resolution that said, of course, the Palestinian refugees have the right to return unconditionally, unless they don't want to. But practically, when you see the powers that really mattered, that is the United States, Britain, France, they did not translate the United Nations resolution into a pressure on Israel to allow the repatriation or the return of the refugees. They concocted this idea that the United Nations will look for the welfare pending a solution. And the message to the Palestinian refugees was very clear. So as Ghada told us that her mother was not buying things and so on because people believed that they would return. This, we have to remember, this is a message that came from the international community. You will return, of course. There is a United Nations General Assembly that assures you that. So Palestinians did not want to build stone houses in Lebanon and in Syria and so on because they really believe that this is just a matter of diplomacy that eventually will work itself out. But of course, the people who were responsible for this policy in the international community, in collusion with Israel, really worked under the assumption that is usually attributed to David Ben-Gurion, but I don't think he said it. He could have said it, but I think only one of his aides said it. But this was the Israeli mentality. Half of the refugees would die, and half of the refugees would forget. Now, of course, and this is why Israel was stalling for time, saying eventually they would be resettled, and the world will forget about it. We did a successful ethnic cleansing. These people will never come back. Of course, they were all surprised that in the 1950s, already in the end of the 1950s, the Palestinian refugees re-emerged as a national movement of liberation through the institutions of the PLO and its activity. But this could not have been foreseen in 1949 and 1950. So yes, I think that the international community that once betrayed the Palestinians through the Balfour Declaration, the second time betrayed it through the Mandate Charter, betrayed them again on the third time by allowing Israel to be absolved from the crime against humanity it committed, and by complicating on purpose a very basic human right of return that was translated into what Israel and the West hoped would be a permanent Palestinian presence in the Arab world and beyond.
Thank you, Ilan. Ghada, you've spoken about having this dual identity, and at first you attempted to live the English life, and you lived you married an English man, you sort of disassociated yourself from your Arab roots. But it was a seismic event in 1967 that changed all that and forced you to reevaluate your identity and the political dimension to your life. So can you describe to us what happened there?
Yeah, and you're certainly right that by 1967, I had made for myself an English life, and an English life of a very particular kind, which was a rural life, because where I lived was Bristol, West Country, and the man I married was the son of a farmer who owned a lot of land and had a big farmhouse. And I can't tell you how for me, how lovely I found the whole thing. The log fires, the dogs, the walks in the country, the roast lamb, all this struck me as being just simply wonderful. And I thought I was like everybody else. And I remember actually at that time, a friend said to me, one day, I said to her, I'm Arab. She said, rubbish. You're a dark-skinned English girl. And I always remember that. Anyway, so that's how integrated I was. And then there I was working in a hospital as a junior doctor and with my English husband and feeling fairly secure when the 1967 war erupted. Now, that was a really, really important moment because as the war was being televised, all my colleagues in our doctor's mess, the place where doctors go to relax, eat, etc., all of them were on Israel's side, including my husband, I might add. And when Israel had yet another victory, they would cheer. They would cheer. Of course, I saw, okay, right, well then, who am I? They seem to have no awareness of me, of mine. And that suddenly came to me. They don't have an awareness because I don't have an awareness of who I am. Can I really blame them? It was a terrible moment, and it was the start of a process. Of course, it didn't happen immediately. I had it out with my husband, I remember, and saying, how can you do that? What do you mean? I remember him saying, look, I know it's very upsetting for you, and I know it's not what you'd like to see, but we do have to admit that Israel has done awfully well, and good for them. He still didn't get it. Anyway, as I say, it was that moment. I thought, right, if they're not on my side in this, who am I then? And that started a kind of a painful journey to try and find myself. I know it sounds corny, but I promise you it's real, it's true. And it took me a few years to fit into my new old skin, and to understand that I was a Palestinian Arab, and I always would be. However much I tried to pretend otherwise, that's who I was. And the next stage, of course, was to say, it's good to be a Palestinian Arab. It's good because I am alive. I have a cause. I have to fight for something. And that's how it was. So that led into the early 1970s when I would say I became an activist. I set up a medical charity first in 1972, the first Palestinian medical charity, and then shortly after the organization you mentioned, Palestine Action, which was dedicated to getting the Palestine case known, recognized in Britain. And and I became a total activist from that moment.
Yes, thank you, Ghada.
Yeah, I just want to say, of course, I was not alone. Very quickly, I should tell you, at about that time, I met Edward Said, great Palestinian intellectual, for the first time. And to my astonishment and real pleasure, actually, I discovered the same had happened to him. 1967 had done it for him too. He recognized who he was and would never, ever change again.
And this deep burning injustice, which was within you, Ghada, came to the fore, and you became very active in the Palestinian movement. So, Ilan, what exactly was the Six-Day War, and what were the consequences for Palestinians?
Yes, I don't think we should use the term Six Days War. This is part of the Zionist narrative. The June 67 war was many things, but I think I will just focus on its relevance for the Palestinians because there are other contexts in which we can discuss this war, but I don't think we have the time for this. I think we have to look at it as part of the ambition of the Israeli military and political leadership to complete what they have not completed in 1948. And there was a debate within the Israeli political leadership after 48, in fact, towards the end of 1948, whether they should use their might in order to take over the 22% of Palestine, which they did not occupy during the Nakba, which became the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, Israel did not occupy the West Bank not because, in 48, not because it didn't have the military power to do it, but because it had a secret agreement with the Jordanians. And in return for a very limited Jordanian intervention in the fighting, they would allow King Abdullah, the great grandfather of the present king, to take over that part which became the West Bank. And they did not occupy the Gaza Strip because they needed a receptor to which they, or a kind of a huge prison camp, if you want, into which to push hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in central and South Palestine into a place where they would become refugees and not part of the future Jewish state. So there was a group of Israeli generals, politicians, intellectuals that created a lobby for a greater Israel immediately after the 48 war ended. And several times they tried to convince the government to use one pretext or the other to occupy, particularly the West Bank. They were, to be honest, they were not that interested in the Gaza Strip in particular at that period, but definitely they wanted to find an excuse for occupying the West Bank. And in 1960, they nearly did it. The same kind of chain of events that brought about the 67 war actually occurred in 1960. Israel was diverted the waters of the Jordan River to its own use and threatened the more radical Arab regimes, especially in Syria, in bringing its downfall, and of course also Nasser in Egypt. And they retaliated against the Fidayun in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip, and also imposed some sort of a collective punishment on the Jordanian army. And Jamal Abdel Nasser, already in 1960, thought that he should try and threaten Israel and prevent it from what he believed would be an imminent Israeli attack both on Jordan and Syria. And he drove his army into the Sinai Peninsula. But at that time, the Israeli Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, did not wish a military confrontation. And he did all kinds of things, which I don't have time to go into it. But anyway, the 1960 crisis ended in a diplomatic way. The same chain of events happened in 1967, diversion of the water, threats to topple the regime in Syria, retaliation operation that attacked the Jordanian army in the West Bank. But this time there was no Israeli prime minister who was worried whether it was a good idea or not a good idea to occupy the West Bank with 1 million and so Palestinians who lived there after he himself kicked out 1 million Palestinians in 1948. Now with his withdrawal, the people who were running the Israeli political elite between 1963 and 1967 could prepare a far more detailed plan for taking over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And they were waiting for the opportunity, and they used the development in May, June 67 to implement that idea of creating the greater Israel. Of course, at any given moment between the beginning of that crisis, which is the 15th of May, let's say 1967, until the beginning of the Israeli assault on the 5th of June 1967. At every given moment, including on the 4th of June, it was possible to stop it if Israel wanted. But we now have also quite a good access to the Israeli documentation from that period. And it was very clear that half of the Israeli government were generals from 1948, frustrated by the fact that Israel did not use the opportunity in 1948 to occupy the West Bank. They decided to make sure that despite the attempts of King Hussein to just be symbolically involved in the war and trying to minimize the contact, to use it for an occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip with the idea of never giving it up, even if they use the rhetoric of peace and territory for peace later on. There was hardly anyone in the political elite in Israel or military elite that deemed these territories as negotiable or anything but an integral part of what they deemed to be Eretz Israel or the land of Israel. So this is more or less the 67 war in the Palestinian context. As I said, there are other contexts, the Syrian one, the Egyptians, but I won't go into it.
Thank you, Ilan. Well, back to you, Ghada. You went back several times, and you even found your old home in Jerusalem at one point that was occupied by a Jewish family. And you did return to Palestine in 2005 to work as a consultant to the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah. What did your experiences there tell you about governance under occupation and the day-to-day life of Palestinians?
Well, yeah, yes, I did go. I did go to visit Palestine a number of times. And then I decided in 2005 that these sort of sporadic visits weren't good enough. I wanted to go and live there and try to get a feel for how it was. I knew, of course, that where I was going was not the Palestine that I was born in. I certainly wasn't working in Jerusalem. I'd be working in Ramallah. So I did that. I would say, how can I sum it up really? It was a terribly sad experience. I honestly, everything I saw in all the towns and villages that I visited really had one lesson for me. People must be free. They can't live like that. That is not a life. And I felt that everybody was somehow waiting, that, you know, they could be patient and stoic for the time being until ... you know. And I must say, hearing Ilan talk about the Resolution 194 and the collusion from the Western world with Israel to dupe the Palestinian people into telling them, look, it's okay, you know, well, nobody's forgotten that that's where you came from and you're going to go back there with doing nothing about it. You know, I found a replica of that in another way, and I'll tell you what it was. Everywhere I went at that time, the air was buzzing with the so-called Palestinian state. Now, the Palestinian state was going to happen. There's no question, and the whole international groupings of so-called NGOs, USAID, the British Council, all these people were in collusion for the idea, to promote the idea to the Palestinians that it was just a matter of getting prepared for statehood, because it was going to happen. That was the implication. So therefore, all the people I came across, the educated, the bright young people, were running around working for these NGOs. What on? State building, in quotes, state building initiatives. And, you know, that was the most sickening aspect of it. that when you thought about it and you realized no state was going to happen, anybody who thinks that or is trying to foster this idea knows nothing about Israel, hasn't been listening, you know. So that was really depressing. And of course, the whole charade of the Palestinian Authority making do a pretending that it's a real government, that it is an authority with some authority, when we know very well the facts. And so much so that I remember, and it's in that memoir, Return, it's like the emperor's new clothes, you know. I started to be like them when I saw the ministers come and go, and the minister with his guards, and, you know, the president come and go, and the prime minister, you know, it persuaded you that there really was something there, that there really was a state. And of course, there was no such thing. What there was a people who had various responses to being ruled by Israel. Partly resignation, partly rebellion, partly a sort of an interaction. That's the best way to put it, I think. You know, that you wheel and deal with the occupation forces, you know, whether you can get a permit, whether you can't get a permit, all this kind of stuff everybody was so busy with in order to find some kind of a life under foreign rule. So in the end, there was nowhere I went where I felt hope, where I thought that this was, yes, this looks like the start of something that's going to grow, even though, and at the same time, I saw that the Palestinians were, in many senses, unbeaten. I could see that they had retained a sense of themselves, that they hadn't totally crumbled, that they had the makings of a decent liberation movement within them. So what can I say? The truth was that at the time, I felt very bad. I felt despairing. And nothing, and at the same time, the rage I spoke about before was still there. If anything, it was greater, because I could see the way Israel had got away with it. And in the end, you know, I remember thinking then and writing and so on and saying, you know, in the end, this is about Israel's impunity. It really isn't about what Palestinians did or didn't do and made mistakes. This is about letting Israel get away with it. And that seemed to me to be the basic problem that we have. If Israel had not been allowed to get away with it, it would be a very, very different story today.
Thank you, Ghada. Many might argue today, Ilan, that the Nakba is ongoing, that the process of expulsion and dispossession is happening, and it is happening with the full support of the various organizations of the state. Would you say that's a fair appraisal, and what evidence would you say there is for that?
Oh yes, I think that this is a fair assessment, as the Palestinians call it in Arabic, al-Nakba al-Mustamirra, the ongoing Nakba, is an ongoing, among other things, ethnic cleansing. Of course, Israel as a settler colonial state uses other means in order to implement this whole idea of having as much of Palestine as possible and as few Palestinians as possible. Israel could not always recreate the same kind of conditions in which to perpetrate a similar massive expulsion as it did in 1948. Circumstances changed, the Palestinian resistance appeared, so things were not that easy to go on with the same method, but the aim remained the same aim, and we can see it. Between 1948 to 1966, Israel imposed a very harsh military rule on the Palestinians who remained within the state of Israel. And in the process also continued expulsion of Palestinians, of course not in the same numbers as in 1948, but enough to create another chapter in this history of ethnic cleansing. And 1967 created the problem for Israel. On the one hand, the state finally took over what it wanted in geographical terms, in terms of space. But with it came another Palestinian population. So what they did, they transferred the military regime that they imposed on the Palestinian minority inside Israel and reimpose it on the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Also, during the June 67 war and immediately after that, in the months of June and July, we should remember that Israel perpetrated another ethnic cleansing operation, not at the same magnitude of 48, but quite a big one, of refugee camps near Jericho, of the population in the Muslim quarter in the old city, which created a new Palestinian refugee problem. If you go to Jordan, to Al-Aida camp, you will see that there are refugees from 48, but there are also refugees from 1967, that is 67 war. And after 67, first of all, in the area of Greater Jerusalem, according to Haaretz, 250,000 of Palestinians, there is 250,000, and the number I think is far greater than that, but I'm using them just as a source. 250,000 of people had to leave Greater Jerusalem, either to other parts of the West Bank or to outside of Israel and the occupied territories, not allowed to come back. Israel used all kinds of totally illegal means in the eyes of international law, but nobody seems to care, to downsize the number of Palestinians in the West Bank. For instance, if you spend more than a year in the 60s and the 70s out of the West Bank, you were not allowed to return. In the Greater Jerusalem area, if you had more than one parking ticket, or you failed to pay one of the municipal taxes, this could be a pretext to at least force you to get out of the Greater Jerusalem area, if not from the West Bank. All in all, I think what the Israelis discovered between more or less, I would say, 1973 and until today, that there are other means of making the indigenous native people not part of your population. That it's not always necessary to massively expel people in order to make it a Jewish space from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean. For instance, if you siege a place, if you don't allow people to leave a village, you get the same result as expelling the people from that village. From your perspective as a colonizer, you get the same thing. If you build an apartheid wall, if you impose a blockade and siege on Gaza, if you make life quite impossible for any normal freedom of movement, of study, of work, then you create a similar result from your perspective. Now, look at Area C, especially in the Jordan Valley, in the south of Mount Hebron, which is called Masafir Yatta. Israel already ethnically cleansed the population from these areas. As we are talking, they already have done it. They are ethnically cleansing Bedouins in the Nakba from certain areas. They are limited any progress and development of Palestinians in the Galilee. So these are two aspects of the Nakba, the ongoing Nakba, I think, from 48 until today. One aspect is the continued attempt to somehow exclude the Palestinians from any role in their fate, in their affairs. Different means used for different Palestinian groups, but the idea is the same. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is really to create a reality a reality by which you would know that even if you are in the most preferred status as a Palestinian, I don't know, a vice president, a deputy I'm sorry, a representative in the Israeli Knesset, even if you reach this highest points in your personal career, you are always in a precarious situation, and you are not safe. You know, and I will finish. We just saw it. What was it? I think a few days ago. I don't remember which day it was, but it was a few days ago. Benjamin Netanyahu came to court, collaborative in the city of Nazareth to vote for him in the next election. And it was a huge, spontaneous demonstration led by the Palestinian members of Knesset. And they were beaten like hell by the police, despite the fact that supposedly they have immunity as members of the parliament. For a policeman in Israel, an Arab member of the Knesset doesn't have an immunity, because it doesn't matter that he's a member of the Knesset. What matters is that he's an Arab. And this racist regime that uses different means is making the Nakba an ongoing event. And it's not surprising, you know, scholars of settler colonialism would always stress the point that settler colonialism is not an event, but a structure. It's a structure. And the structure here is the ideology of Zionism. And until we don't get rid of this ideology, Palestinians would not be safe and would always be in danger of being victims of an ongoing Nakba.
Thank you, Ilan. I can see we've got lots of questions coming up, but just to end, I want to ask Ghada, since this title of the talk is Expulsion or Return, how important is the issue of return to the Palestinian struggle for justice?
Look, it's at the heart of it. It's really at the heart of it. It's not an optional extra. It's not a bargaining chip. It's been abused, downgraded repeatedly because Israel wants that, so that people begin to think that it's something, you know, you could either have or maybe you can postpone or whatever. Actually, it's none of those things. It's absolutely fundamental to the Palestinian cause. There would be no Palestinian cause if none of us had been expelled, or having been expelled, had been able to go back. That'd be the end of the Palestine cause, really. So it's that important. And it has a very special place in the hearts and minds of Palestinians. However unattainable it seems, nevertheless, nobody has discarded it. Nobody has said, look, let's forget about that. That's never going to happen. So let's just settle down and face a new reality. That has not happened. And it cannot happen because this is such a clear and living injustice. And, you know, one very quick word just to add to Ilan's explanation about ethnic cleansing. Of course, there has to be ethnic cleansing. There is no Zionism without ethnic cleansing. It's a part, it's an essential part of Zionism. You have to get rid of the non-Jews. It's very obvious. Otherwise, you don't have Zionism. And that's why, for example, I see a question, extremely good question about the latest B'Tselem report. That is why, in a way, for Israel, trying to swallow the 1967 territories is a disaster. And you know, they're trying to deal with it in various ways. They parcel them about, they divide them off each other, they try to make them irrelevant. They make life hell so that they can all go, whatever it is, they can't digest it. They can't digest what they've swallowed. So let me leave it at that. You asked, forgive me, did you ask me for something? You said, how do I feel about return? What,
oh, yeah, you answered it perfectly. Thank you, Ghada. And Ilan, do you have anything to add about the conditions of return, or what would make return possible, or give us that justice?
No, I think we can definitely move to the question. I see that many people who want
Lovely.
to ask questions, and I think we should now hear what people want.
Do you have, I mean, you say, have you seen any questions in particular that you would like to answer? They are
Oh, I see.
directed to
You
you in
want us to do
particular,
it this way.
but I can ask on their behalf.
No, I can read it if you want. Or you can read it. I don't know. What do you prefer? How do you prefer to do this?
I'll read a couple if you like.
Yeah, it's easier because reading and
Yeah, there's been a question to you, Ilan, from Nick Bilborough, who says, can you tell us the story of your own conversion to the cause, or did you grow up in a pro-Palestinian environment?
Thank you, Nick, for the question. No, I didn't grow in a pro-Palestinian environment at all. I grew in a kind of, can call it typical Zionist family, not particularly active politically, but definitely not particularly active anti-Zionist in any way. No, this is not, I cannot blame my parents or my educational system for my views today. They're totally innocent of this. I think that this is something that had to do with the fact that I was interested in history first as a very young person, but also then as a professional on the one hand. And then maybe, and this is true, I think, of many of my friends who subscribe to similar views among the Jewish community inside Israel, not many, but they exist. I think we adopted from the very beginning a universal perspective of justice, of morality, of humanity, and nothing that we became aware of, when we became aware of what Israel did in the past or was doing in the present, could really be justified by the most basic human values of justice, peace, and dignity. It takes time because you are indoctrinated in Israel from cradle to the grave. It's not easy. Your own society doesn't approve of your views, so you need to be very strong in terms of sticking to your beliefs and so on. I think it helps to get out, as I did for my doctorate studies. It helps to get out of Israel and to see things differently, to meet Palestinians as equals and not within the apartheid system. And so this is about the background. As for conversion, I don't think, as I know also from other friends, there is no moment of epiphany. It's not that you suddenly, you wake one morning and it all seems clear. It's a journey. It's a journey. There is a point where, not easy to detect, but you know it exists, where there's no return. You cannot go back. You know too much. You are aware too much of what goes on, and you can't come back. I think for me, this was more or less around 1982, when I was a student in England. The Israeli attack on Lebanon in 1982, I think I was able to see it in different ways than people saw it inside Israel. And of course, meeting Rada and Edward Said, and having Albert Hourani, Lebanese, but very pro-Palestinian Lebanese, as a supervisor in the university, helps you. So this period was the period of transition, and of course the fact that I was working in 48 and the documentation was very, very clear that whatever I thought I knew and whatever people taught me and told me was a big lie. And what Palestinian friends began to tell me was totally validated by the archival material that I was looking at as a postgraduate student at the time.
Thank you very much, Ilan. I have a question here from Simon Hester. He says there's a lot of pessimism about Israel-Palestine. He points to the fact that, Ilan, you've recently written an optimistic article in International Socialism about the political activity and movements of young Palestinians in both Palestine and abroad. And he's asking if you are optimistic, and Ghada, if you are optimistic about the future. So perhaps, Ghada, we should come to you first.
Yeah, look, I don't think that I have a settled frame of mind about this. It sort of varies with experience in a way, you know. It's really a volatile situation. If I come across and I listen to and I observe the activism taking place amongst the younger generation, I get hopeful because it seems to me it's stronger even than our excitement about this. It's really very gratifying. But then, you know, when I look at the odds against us, stacked against us, they are so immense. I can't pretend it's not there. And that puts me into another swing in which I think, with all the best will in the world, with all the enthusiasm in the world, you cannot fight this war machine that is Israel and this its backer, the United States, you know. And so I'm sorry, it's probably an unsatisfactory answer, but it would not be honest if I said to you, I was running around feeling, yes, it's all very difficult now, but it's all going to come right in the end. It's not how I feel.
Thank you. Ilan?
I think optimism in this, and this is what I was trying to say in the article that you mentioned, is not about any kind of prediction that the balance of power is going to change tomorrow, that Israel is not going to be the state with the largest and strongest army in the Middle East, and the Palestinians continue to be not going to be fragmented, not united, and the international community would not continue to adopt this policy that provides Israel with immunity for its impunity on the ground. I didn't mean by that's not optimism. Optimism is from the fact that despite these facts, and despite what we talked about before, the ongoing Nakba, there are large sections among young people, young Palestinians, and the Palestinians are one of the youngest society in the world, who are constantly looking for new ways, for new ideas to try and deal with that reality. And I think this means that they're still there. They're still there. And this gives you hope, not for tomorrow, and maybe not even for the day after tomorrow. But it's sort of, from historical perspective, you say, you know, evil regimes in the end of the day come to an end. Situation of oppression and colonization do not continue forever. And one of the main reasons it happens is because the people themselves do not disappear. The victims do not disappear. They continue to struggle in a different way. They have setbacks. There are periods which are there's less activity and periods with more activity. But I think the message to Israel should be, the Palestinians are there to stay. The Palestinian struggle will continue. Because the Israelis sort of count all these achievements that they had, one cannot deny. They kicked out the PLO from Lebanon. They duped the PLO into one of the most horrible treaty of submission in modern history, the Oslo Accord. This is all true. This is all absolutely true. And yet, the impulse for freedom, for liberation, is not only there. The civil society in the world, unlike the political elites, unlike the academic elites, unlike the the mainstream media, the civil society fully understands this, And I don't think there was ever a period where among civil societies around the world there was such total support for the Palestinian cause. In fact, you sometimes feel that maybe we're missing here an opportunity because there isn't a united Palestinian leadership, because there isn't a clear Palestinian strategy and an end game, which is very unfortunate, that we're not exploiting correctly this historical moment where Palestine is identified with justice and freedom by so many people around the world. Yes, it doesn't, you go and visit, as I did before the COVID-19, you visit the Jenin refugee camp. On the one hand, young people there say to you, and it's a very young camp, 60% of the people in Jenin refugee camp are below 18. On the one hand, they say to you, tell the Israelis we are still here, despite everything they tried to do to us and massacre us in 2002. We are still here. We're not going away. And we are still dreaming of the return. On the other hand, they are, of course, disappointed that when you tell them how much their struggle is supported, that there is no indication on the ground that anything changes. And I think that's what Rada meant. I mean, you have to be a bit ambivalent here, because everything is pointing to the fact that Israel becomes more and more a pariah state in the eyes of so many people, and yet the powers that be do not seem to be impressed by it. Arab regimes are not seen to be impressed by it either, and this creates this ambivalence. But in the long term, I think there is also a cause for optimism, not just pessimism.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a question which came in quite early on from Lauren Steiner. And she was asking, I think directed to you, Dr. Pappé, what do you think of the strategy of the new American group of young Jews called If Not Now, of just opposing the occupation and the violence against Palestinians and not taking a stand on Zionism or the two-state solution or BDS movement as a way to have the biggest tent and attract the most American Jews, especially young Jews, to the cause?
Yes, it's very anachronistic. It's something that already disappeared in Israel. It's called liberal Zionism. Of course, you oppose the occupation of the West Bank and the nature of that occupation. It's a very well detailed and known brutality, unlike the one in 1948 or before 67. So, of course, as an American Jew, you feel very uncomfortable about it. And you somehow analyze it as if it's just the wrong policy pursued by the wrong government. And there's nothing ideologically problematic with the Jewish state. And you don't recognize that these policies, happened in the past, and are not just happening in the West Bank. And they are the result of an ideology. It's a position that would be similar to someone who, during the time of apartheid South Africa, would be particularly moved by the massacre in Soweto and would like to condemn the apartheid South African government for what it did in Soweto, but has no problem with the continuation of the apartheid regime. It's an unfortunate position. It's an attempt to square the circle, which at least it's interesting. In Israel, it disappeared. We don't have a Zionist left in Israel anymore. We have center and center-right and right, and anti-Zionist groups, but they are not participating in the political game. So, I mean, even the Israeli Jews realize that this is not a tenable position, and I don't think that this is going to work in any way or form as an important contribution to the struggle for justice and freedom in Palestine.
Thank you, Ilan. I think this sort of leads on to the next question, which has been put by Tony Greenstein, who asks, what do you think will be the impact of the declaration by B'Tselem that Israel is one apartheid state from the river to the sea? Ghada, would you like to?
Well, first of all, I was astonished by that report and frankly, I'm very pleased, because what it was doing, it was setting out clearly and for everybody to read the reality a reality which we know has been the reality since 1967, meaning that there is no border, there is no Palestinian territories in inverted commas. There is a whole country from the river to the sea, which is ruled by one sovereign power, and that is Israel. It's a one state. This is a one state. And so in that sense, it's good that people should know it, particularly the two staters. The people are still talking about two states, and the idea that you could actually partition this land and that this thing is going to happen. Of course not. That is the reality. And it's good it came from the horse's mouth. You know, Palestinians have been saying this kind of thing forever. Nobody listens. But when you have an Israeli Jewish group that comes out with this, and very lucidly, I must say, it's very welcome. And I should say it's welcome in another sense. First, of course, it is clarity. It makes clear what the real situation is. And in my view, it asks us, in a way, to move on. Therefore, it begs the question, what next? What's the next step? Since there really is only one state, and it is an apartheid state, what do we do with that reality? What do we do with it? And I have my ideas about how that should be utilized, not just lamented over or condemned. It should be actually the starting point of the way forward, of the next step. And I mean, I know people who know me and read what I write. In my own case, and I will be brief because this is another meeting, actually. It's a subject of another meeting, is that once you've understood this is a one state and that half its people have no rights, then the next obvious step says, then those people, the people without rights, need rights. Therefore, you, Israel, either you get out of their territory or they have to have rights. You can't rule them without rights. And that seems to me to be the next step. And it's been paved by this very clear report and welcome report.
Thank you. That's fantastic. I would just, before we wrap this up, I would just like to read one comment that has come from Raja Jasir, who is in Gaza in Palestine, and she writes, I'm a Palestinian from Gaza. My family was ethnically cleansed from a village called Najd back in 1948. I'm 32 years old now. I have never been to a place in Palestine other than Gaza, except for Nablus, where I had to go for treatment, and of course after taking what is called Israel's authority or permission. How unjust is that? Right of return is something I powerfully believe in and fight for. It is a sacred right. So thank you very much, Raza. I think we will have to wrap that up, but I would like to say on behalf of everybody here tonight, thank you so much, Ilan. Thank you so much, Ghada. Your testimony and your insights were very powerful and very helpful. And we hope, as you say, there is optimism and a basis for some improvements in the situation. And as you say as well, Ilan, there are a lot of young people who are joining our movement, and we at the Hastings and Rye Palestine Solidarity Campaign have never had so many members. So, you know, we are always growing. Before everyone leaves, I would just like to say, yes, do have a look and please do read Ilan and Ghada's books. Ghada's memoirs are available from her publisher Verso, and they're just excellent, beautifully written, and take you right on those journeys with her. I found myself really very moved. And Ilan's titles are brilliantly researched and very accessible, and really quite shocking and enlightening. And they include The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, 10 Myths About Israel, The Biggest Prison on Earth, to name just a few, and I have some behind me here. We're also grateful to you, our audience, for coming today. We are a small but very active campaigning group which aims to raise awareness and understanding of the Palestinian struggle for justice. So like tonight, we put on talks and discussions, we send out regular e-newsletters, we try and bring Palestinian culture and entertainment to our community, and we fundraise for humanitarian causes, as well as carrying out actions of solidarity and support. For just £10, you can join and become a member, or if you're unwaged, it's £5, to be part of this growing movement for justice, equality and freedom. Or if you'd just like to support our work without joining, you can make a donation or a contribution. We're putting up the information in the chat box now. So thank you everybody for coming, and if you are interested in joining us, you can have a look at our website, Hastings Palestine Campaign. And in the meantime, thank you, Ghada, again. Thank you, Ilan. It's been an absolute pleasure. We're honoured.
And thank you, Katie, for such intelligent chairing of this meeting.
Here, here. Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right.
Everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Good night.
Good night. Good night.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.